we are in the condition we are in the state of ignorance we are in the state of war, in the state of economic depression, in the state of depletion of the resources of our planet because of the greed of psychopaths who thought they could create their own reality. Well, look at the reality they created.
You're listening to SOTT Talk Radio, the world for people who think.
Hello and welcome to another SOTT Talk Radio show. I'm Neil Bradley. My co-host is Joe Quinn.
Hi there.
And with us this week to discuss NATO's secret armies in Europe is special guest Dr. Daniele Ganser. Daniele is a historian and researcher specializing in energy issues, economic history, geostrategy and international contemporary history since 1945. He is the founder and owner of the Swiss Institute for Peace and Energy Research. Daniele lectures history and the future of energy systems at the University of St. Gallen and conflict studies at the Institute of Sociology at the University of Basel. His book, NATO's Armies in Europe, NATO's Secret Armies in Europe, has been translated into 10 languages, and he has a new book out called Europe in the Oil Rush, depicting the struggle for oil in the future. A very warm welcome to you, Daniele. Thanks very much for coming on our show.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, we've been aware of your book for some time, and we've read it, and it's absolutely excellent. It was published in 2005, but the research that went into it was originally part of your PhD thesis.
That's correct, yes. I did my PhD in history in the late 90s, and at that time most people said terrorism is not very interesting, but I decided to research terrorism and manipulated terrorism, and I finished the PhD in September 2001.
Well, that's interesting timing, isn't it? People say, well, that's past now.
It suddenly came back.
It came back
front and center in a big way, you know, right when you finished your PhD. I suppose you did you find that a little bit? What was your impression at the time of the September 11th attacks after having just completed all of this work?
Yeah, I was surprised that the terror issue came back so strongly, because I started the PhD in 98, researched it in 99, 2000, 2001. And at that time, it was 4 years of research. I had many encounters of people who said, why don't you work on the United Nations or NATO or, NGO issues, and why do you work on terrorism? It's really, that was interesting in the 70s in Germany when we had the Rote Armee-Fraktion, or, when the Ireland conflict with IRA was hot and boiling. But now, it's a history thing. And I said, no, I'm really interested in this. And then when the 9/11 attacks happened, I was, of course, from the beginning, always bothered by this question: is this now manipulated state terrorism, or is this, real Al Qaeda is guilty for it? And it was Osama bin Laden who surprised Bush and Cheney. So, I from the beginning, I had this mindset because it was my academic training.
Yeah. So people, as you said, people were suggesting, or your friends or your peers were suggesting that you go and work for NATO, but instead you decided to investigate NATO essentially as part of your PhD. And I mean, what you turned up, just in reading your book, it's, I suppose, apart from the details, the shocking details within the actual chronology of events in Europe, the most shocking thing for me is that, as far as I'm aware, very, very few people know about this, know about GLADIO, know about NATO's stay-behind armies, and have any awareness that any of this was going on. Like people today, you go and ask someone if they know what GLADIO is, and they say no.
Yeah, no, they have no clue. Like most people out there in the streets, if you ask, do the test with your friends and ask them whether they know what NATO's secret armies or GLADIO is, and most would say they have never heard of it, because, in fact, when I approached the subject, I went to some of my best professors in international history and contemporary history, and I asked them, do you have any knowledge on Operation GLADIO? And that was at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE in London. That was, pretty good university, and these professors are widely read, and they're clever guys. And they said, I remember vaguely that in 1990 there was in Italy, Giulio Andreotti, and there was an Italian political scandal, and something emerged, which the details I can't recall. So they had no clue of it, and if the professors for political science and contemporary history don't know it, I mean, how are you going to expect anybody in the street to know much about it? And that hasn't changed until today. My book has reached a certain audience of a few thousand people, but obviously it's not millions that read it.
Yeah,
a few thousand.
Unfortunately, but what I find amazing is that before I get into that, why do you think people like you just cited, professors in eminent universities, etc., why were they not aware of this? Is it the information wasn't available? Or, I mean, surely they had come across it or seen reference to it, but why do you think historians would have so little interest in this? Is there some kind of emotional component to it where they don't want to believe what the evidence suggests, or?
I think the main reasons for historians not to research secret warfare, it clearly is an example of secret warfare, and we have many examples of secret warfare during the last 70 years. The main reasons that they don't want to research secret warfare is because it's such a difficult area to research. You always have a mixture of lies and propaganda and hard facts, and it's very hard to say, is this now hard fact, or is this lies, or is this propaganda?
Right.
So if you go into this subject, you can burn yourself in the sense of that you will pick up a story and you think it's factual. And then it can be that later you find out, oh no, I got it wrong. I got it all wrong. Yeah. It's a secret service who put up some stories, and I followed that story. And so it's more. I think it's more the it's like a jungle. It's a very big jungle with very, very dangerous animals. And they say, why should I go into that jungle? It's a mess. I don't want to go into that terrorism debate. I don't want to go into the secret warfare debate. And so they stay away. But still, if you look at the market, there are lots of books from veteran soldiers who write about their lives, basically, or people who worked in the secret services who then publish their books, or parliamentary reports from senators who've investigated the secret services, how they operate and what's going on. So I think in the end, it's possible to go into that big jungle and find a few facts. It's possible, but it's always delicate.
Yeah, well, you've certainly done a very good job, and you've dared to go where apparently other historians dare not go, and it's a very well researched book. I don't think anybody could question the evidence that you presented. But maybe you can just give us just to start out, give us a short and as short as possible description of what GLADIO or NATO's stay-behind armies were.
The secret armies were set up after World War II. So World War II ended in 1945, and then NATO was formed in 1949. So just 4 years after the end of the Second World War, NATO was formed. And NATO at the time had the clear task to fight communism, to fight the Soviet Union. But they had the problem that they were thinking, if Western Europe is occupied by the Red Army, if the Russians come and occupy Germany, France, and Italy, and Spain, and all parties, all countries, then we need to have a secret weapon. We need to have a resistance army that, operates behind enemy lines. That's why you have that term, stay behind. And so they set up a secret army and said, you will operate behind enemy lines, and that's why we give you arms caches hidden in forests, or in Italy sometimes in cemeteries, or on remote villages, and they had explosives, and they had guns, and the idea was to work as a resistance and to blow up communication structures of the occupying Soviet army, or to blow up bridges, or, if you then have NATO pilots who fight in France against Soviets occupying France, if they were shut down, they could then exfiltrate these pilots. So that was the original idea, to just have a second option, a second card. And William Colby, who in the 70s was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the American Secret Service, Foreign Secret Service, he wrote the book called Honorable Men, where he tried to defend the CIA. And he wrote that book and explained how he set up the secret armies in the neutral countries, in Sweden and in Finland, and that he set them up in NATO countries, in Norway and in Denmark. And that really was the official story, just to become active in case of a Soviet invasion. And obviously, we know today that there was no such invasion, but there was a more sinister, a more darker option to these secret armies, and that was exactly to become active in case of emergency, in the total absence of a Soviet invasion.
Yeah, if that was the justification for it, in the event of a Soviet invasion, what it seemed to morph into was, in the event of a leftist shift in power in any given country that had a secret army. And it was at this point in which these networks would become activated.
That is the delicate part of it, yeah.
It's incredible when you think of 14 countries, how many different, like say, political crises, or even just routine elections did each of those countries have in that span of 40, 50 years, and how many of them were interfered with by the activation of one of these networks?
Yeah, I mean that is really the thing. When you look at the history of Europe, you take it from 45 until 2014 today. Most people think of Europe as just a place of peace. There was no war, and there was no problem, there was no terror. It was just a place of stability. But that's not true. I mean, that's a very superficial look at it. Obviously, we didn't have the Vietnam War here, or we didn't have the Korean War here. We were not bombed like Iraq or Afghanistan or Sudan or many other countries. But Europe had many problems during the Cold War. We had military coups, 3 of them in Turkey. We had a right-wing dictatorship in Spain under Franco, with a right-wing dictatorship in Portugal under Salazar, and we had a military coup in Greece in the 60s. And we had a lot of terrorist attacks in Italy in the 60s, and the 70s, and in the 80s. And we had terrorist attacks in the 80s in Belgium, and also in France, terrorist attacks. And what researchers now try to find out is whether the secret army organized by NATO, run by the CIA, and run by MI6 had anything to do with these tragic events. Because it has to be said, in all honesty, that quite a few of these secret soldiers were just waiting for the Soviet invasion. These were people inspired by the French resistance, who had fought against Hitler, or with the Norwegian resistance, which had fought against the German occupation of Norway in World War II. And they thought, it's very possible that the Soviets come and occupy our country. Now in hindsight, we know that this didn't happen, but we can't, sort of say that they should have known that in the 50s. There was no chance that they didn't have that certainty. So, I always make this point that there were few good people in these secret armies, and we can't sort of all lump them together as terrorists. That would be unfair. But on the other hand, we also have the evidence, and that was the Italian magistrate Felice Casson. He was a judge, and he investigated acts of terrorism in Italy. And we have the evidence that one specific case of a terrorist attack, which was occurring in 1972 in the small village of Peterno in Italy, was directly linked to this secret network of NATO. So what Felice Casson found is that he said, we had this terrorist attack in 1972, a few people were killed in this attack, and at the time, the news, the media, television, radio, newspapers, all said that was the extreme left responsible for this terrorist attack. So the general effect on the population was to discredit the communists and the socialists because they were very strong in the Italian parliament.
Yeah.
And people were saying, oh, they're all terrorists, okay? And only 10 years later, Felice Casson found out, oh no, actually, this was all twisted, it was all lies, it was all turned around. This terrorist attack had not been carried out by the extreme left, but it had been carried out by the extreme right. Vincenzo Vinciguerra was the terrorist who had carried out the attack. He was a member of Ordine Nuovo, which is a right-wing terroristic organization in Italy. And he confessed, he confessed and he said, okay, I carried out this attack, but there is, within the Secret Service in Italy, a lot of support for it. In fact, there is a secret network within the Secret Service which is linked to NATO. And at the time, that was in the 1980s, everybody went like, that's a conspiracy theory. That can't be true. It's totally impossible that the Secret Service would support terrorism, or it's totally impossible that NATO would set up secret armies. I mean, people couldn't, even imagine that. And then in 1990, Giulio Andreotti, who was then Prime Minister of Italy, was actually forced by the Italian Senate to step forward and explain, yes, true indeed, we had a secret army in Italy. Yes, true indeed, the name of this secret army was GLADIO. Yes, true indeed, the Secret Services were running this operation, the American CIA and the British MI6, set up the network after World War II. And so we have the data that the secret armies existed. We have the data that's all confirmed that the secret armies were supplied and trained by CIA, MI6, and, special forces like the SAS from the UK or the Green Berets from the US. And we know all that, but and NATO and CIA confirmed that they exist. But what we don't have is official confirmation of CIA or official confirmation of NATO that they carried out terrorism in Europe. You have to understand that this is a huge taboo.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's too recent.
if you could prove that NATO carried out terrorism in Europe, I mean, NATO would have to be dissolved, immediately as a huge threat.
And it would have serious implications for its current rationale, namely the sort of recreation of Cold War II. You need NATO to protect Europe and the US from
against the
those
Russian Federation. Yeah. What I find interesting, though, Daniele, is there seems to be a disconnect between this rationale amongst these secret groups and the NATO hierarchy, where they all apparently were afraid or of a Soviet invasion, a communist invasion of Europe, and they justified the creation of these essentially terrorist groups to defend against a communist invasion. Yet in Italy, during the period that we're talking about in the 70s and 80s, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party in Italy were very strong, reflecting the kind of a consensus amongst the people who apparently weren't afraid of the communists and actually supported them.
Yeah, they did. That's the problem that NATO has. They had, on the one hand, they had the Soviets in Moscow. They had all the atomic weapons, aimed against them. There was a real battle between the two groups. And at the other hand, they had elected communist member of parliament in Italy, in France, in Belgium, and a few other countries. And they said, if these members, imagine Italy, there's a member of parliament who then becomes, gets the chance to go into the executive branch, that's become a minister, and, minister of the interior or minister of defense even. NATO's totally shocked by even this thought. It never happened. But they thought it could happen, and then we have a communist Italian defense minister, and that'd be nightmare number one, because he would then just phone Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev or who was in charge in Moscow and tell them all the secrets of NATO, because as defense minister of Italy, he obviously had access to NATO secrets. And this was this sort of thinking that you could not have the communists in the Italian government. And in fact, when Aldo Moro, who was a member of the Democrazia Cristiana, which is a center government in Italy, said we should have the communists in government. He was killed. And the whole idea of preventing communists in Italy from coming into executive power positions was very, very, very far-reaching in Italy. And the problem is that if you have such a problem, if you now, let's imagine you and me are NATO generals, okay? It's hard to imagine, but let's just try, because that's what we have to do as historians. We have to think in the head of somebody else. And we think, okay, we're now NATO generals, we're fighting the Soviets, and we see that in Italy the communists are very strong, then, and that's a working assumption, then the idea is, okay, we have this secret army in Italy, and why don't we take the secret army and blow up a few bombs, kill a few people, and then say, the communists did it, and that will really discredit them very badly, and on that basis we can keep them out of government. And that is called the strategy of tension. And that is something which an Italian magistrate, and so that's a judge in Italy, he discovered it, and he actually blew Felice Casson. He blew the whole scandal.
So,
yeah.
But the question here for me is, it seems to me that they weren't afraid of a communist ideology. You say in your book, and it's true, that at a certain point it became clear that there would be no communist or Russian Soviet invasion of Europe, but they continued on with these actions to discredit leftist groups and communist groups in Europe to keep them out of power. And I don't really think that, I can't believe that this was just a purely ideological battle for these people. I mean, obviously there was something they were fighting against in terms of a communist or leftist government coming to power in European countries, how that would negatively affect these, Western American aligned power brokers. I mean, what did they stand to lose if a communist party or a communist or leftist government, or even just a leftist government, came to power in European countries? What was the problem with that? I mean, it didn't include an inevitable communist invasion of Europe. So
the fear of Washington, I think, was that some countries might even leave NATO. I mean, take Norway. I mean, there was the idea at some point that you could have Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden as a nuclear arms-free zone. That was an idea that the Swedish, who were not member of NATO, still are not member of NATO, put forward and said, let's try that. Let's try to have this a nuclear-free zone. So you did not only have the communists, you also had the peace movement, which is always very critical of NATO, and we don't need all this military spending. We don't need all these arms in Europe, and we don't want these Pershing missiles. There's many things we don't want. And once you have a population which goes against the Vietnam War and goes against NATO and basically says we shouldn't kill each other, and all these ideas of the peace movement. If they get very strong, then as a NATO general, once again, let's think as a NATO general, then you just blow up a bomb somewhere in Rome or in Milan or in Bologna, and then you say, wait, the world is full of terrorists, and now we're here to protect you. It's like the fireman who sets fire to your house, and then the next morning comes over and says, hey, gee, very good, that you have a fire department here in the city. We need an extra $1,000 from you to support our work. So you create the problem and you present yourself as a solution. And it's a very diabolic strategy, but if you come to think of it, it works. I mean, what I tried to do then is I looked at, do we have any evidence that the Pentagon general signed anything like that? Because obviously we have Italian judges who say, okay, the Americans created terrorism in Europe. We have Italian members of the secret services even. You have to imagine that in Italy you then had trials. So trials on these terrorist attacks. And then the secret services from Italy had to stand there, and they had to, they were accused that they had carried out terrorist attacks in the country. And people were outraged and were like, why did you kill children and women? And I mean, what sort of secret service are you to go out there and kill people, you know? Mm-hmm. And then the members of the Italian secret services, one was Daniele Maletti. He said, you know, I tried to keep that secret for many years, and now Prime Minister Andreotti comes forward and tells it to Parliament. It's incredible. And others said, the Americans have asked us to do this, you know, to fight and discredit the left in Italy and to increase the strength of NATO. But for historians like me, it was very, very complicated to find a document, a Pentagon document, that would give support to the theory that the Pentagon indeed uses strategy of tension. I mean, the whole debate is strategy of tension debate. Mm-hmm. Carry terrorist attack, blame somebody else for it. And the one document I found is Operation Northwoods. Probably familiar with it. Should I quickly explain what it is?
Yeah.
Operation Northwoods was an operation in the Caribbean in the 1960s. The idea of the U.S. at the time was to have a regime change in Cuba and overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. And so what they did is in 1961, they had the Bay of Pigs invasion carried out by the CIA. It was obviously illegal, but they did it, and it failed. Okay, the Bay of Pigs invasion by the CIA failed in 1961. And then the Pentagon sort of said, well, the CIA messed it up. Now we have a good plan because we're much cleverer than the CIA people. We are here people at the Pentagon. And the Pentagon generals drew up this plan and said, let's explode an American ship, blow it up on Guantanamo Bay, which is the American U.S. military base in Cuba. And that was a very, you know, diabolic idea again. You know, blow up your own ship and then blame Fidel Castro for it. And say, oh, you know, Fidel Castro blew it up. And this is, again, the same trick of the fireman that I said before. Set fire to the house and then present yourself as the solution. And the second idea, it was not only the idea to blow up a ship. The second idea of Operation Northwoods was, let's take planes, civilian planes, fly them over Cuba, and then blow them up. So there would be drones. You know, you wouldn't put people in them. But you have planes, blow them up and say, in the American, television, say, okay, Fidel Castro shot down planes, and in these planes we had American girls who want to go to Bolivia to help the poor people there. So if you connect a very strong story with a false flag terrorist attack, then you have everybody in shock. And then people go like, oh, let's invade Fidel Castro's Cuba and overthrow this dictator. He's really bad.
Yeah.
And the third idea was to carry out terrorist attacks in Miami and in Washington, and then prepare fake documents that would say, you know, these were communists, these were Cubans. Now, this is Operation Northwoods, and we have the original documents, and we know that the Pentagon generals, the highest members of the Pentagon, this is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they signed it. That was Lyman Lemnitzer. And then Kennedy, at the time president, he didn't want it. You know, at the time he was really fighting the military-industrial complex, and he said, we don't want that. And Lemnitzer was then transferred to Europe as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. So he was actually going to Europe and worked within NATO at a time when he was before in the U.S. thinking about strategy of tension terrorism in Cuba. And the European researchers now try to find out, is it possible that Pentagon generals have carried out strategy of tension terrorism in Europe? And we can't prove it. We just have,
circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, circumstantial evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we've never had a U.S. officer coming forward and saying, I'm sorry, we did it.
Yeah.
It's bad. Never.
Although there's been plenty of people in Europe who have come forward and said that. But just to link that back to what I was saying earlier on, then it seems that the strategy of tension and NATO stay behind armies and their kind of funding of terrorist groups to attack civilian populations. This wasn't for really to fight against the spread of communism over Europe, but rather to maintain Europe as essentially in the Western sphere of influence, and also to ensure that it remained on a kind of a militarized war footing, which ultimately generates money for the arms manufacturers.
Yes, it's always, if we have, bombs that drop on Syria, if we have bombs in Ukraine, if we have bombs on Iraq, the Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon, they always profit from it. War is a business. That's something I explain to my students all the time. I tell them, get rid of this nonsense idea that war is some sort of a project to help the poor or help women or help the elderly. They suffer. They suffer tremendously in wars. You have more, you have more rape in wars always because, soldiers go completely mad and start to rape women, and you go like, wasn't the war meant to help women? I go, no. The war was never meant to help anybody. War has always been a tool to help the defense industry, once, and second, to gain influence, to change the shift of power, to overthrow a government that you don't like, to install a new government that you like, and then control a country like Iran or where you had a coup d'etat in 1953 by the CIA. So we're going through all these episodes of history of the last 70 years, and we find a lot of data that secret warfare is real. Okay, secret warfare, these are wars that are not declared. You don't read them in the press, and it says, tomorrow the CIA and the MI6 are going to overthrow the government of Mossadegh in Iran because, they nationalized the oil, and that's no good. We want the oil, and therefore we are overthrowing. You don't have that in the news. In the news, you have, the first novel of Ian Fleming, and you can read it on the stories about James Bond, but that's fiction, okay? And in the real world, we have similar things that are happening, but with no accountability. There's nobody. It's always illegal and criminal, but they got away with a lot of that stuff.
There's a fantastic, a horribly fantastic, if I can use that term, quote in your book from one of these right-wing terrorists in Italy, Vinci Guerra. He said that you had to attack civilians, the people, women, children, innocent people, unknown people far removed from any political game. The reason was quite simple. They were supposed to force these people, the Italian public, to turn to the state to ask for greater security. Yeah, that quote is correct. And keep in mind, Vinci Guerra was the man who carried out the terrorist attack in Peteano. So he was one who knows the strategy of tension. Again, the strategy of tension is a diabolic strategy. You really carry out a terrorist attack, blame somebody else for it. Like let's put it that way. I'd blow up a bomb and then just blame my neighbor. My neighbor will have a huge problem to explain that he didn't blow up the bomb if I put, his passport next to it or whatever, his car, just some incriminating evidence. And then I need the media. That's all I need. The media must tell my story to the whole world. And then people will be shocked and they'll believe it. And only 10 years later, historians like I come and say, hey, we found out it's totally impossible that this man carried the bomb there. It has to be a lie. And it's very difficult for us to reconstruct strategy of tension. But the quote that you just gave is an original quote which shows that terrorism exists, and we have terrorism in the form of state terrorism, manipulated state terrorism. I'm not saying all terrorist attacks are state-sponsored. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying some of the terrorist attacks that we've had during the last 70 years were state-sponsored. And today, historians have to go through all these terrorist attacks again and find out, okay, gee, that's a lot of terrorism we had. Which one was state-sponsored? Which one was carried out by agents of the Secret Service who were actually trying to protect us, to protect the population? You say that we'd have no hard evidence for any of this, that or no hard evidence that the Pentagon or the U.S. government or the CIA were directly involved in this. But it strikes me from reading some of the details in your book that we don't really need it, because there's one you make mention of in March 2001, a General Maletti, who was the former head of Italian counterintelligence, talking about the GLADIO secret army. He said that the massacres, which had discredited the Italian communists, had also been supported by the White House in Washington and the U.S. Secret Service, the CIA.
Yeah.
He said.
I mean, that's one of those quotes. Daniele Maletti says, and not in private conversation with his wife at 12 o'clock at night, but in public in Italy under huge pressure. In the trial of Piazza Fontana. The Piazza Fontana is a place in Milano where we had terrorist attack, and he says, keep in mind the American government, the White House, and especially Nixon. He said Nixon was a strange man, and he goes as far as to say that Nixon promoted terrorism in Italy. He says it in a way that they don't shoot him right away, but he says it in a way that historians who read his testimony, they go like, Jesus Christ, did he just say Nixon sponsored terrorism? Did he just say that? And then we read the quote again, and he basically says that. And it is probably a form of racism that here in Europe we've been thinking that, okay, yes, of course the Americans have bombed Iraq. Yes, they have overthrown the government in Chile in 1973. Oh yes, they have supported the Contras in Nicaragua in the 80s, and yes, they have overthrown the Guatemalan government in 1954, and of course they have bombed Vietnam and Cambodia, and they would certainly not do such things in Europe, and that's it's very deep in European academics' heads that we research these cases in Africa or in Latin America or in Southeast Asia, and we go like, well, gee, that's gruesome. But we never think that it could have happened in Europe, because it was this idea that we're friends, and among friends you wouldn't do it. And then you see that within NATO, it was not just friends. It was a huge battle for who runs the shop and who decides. And there, the Americans, it seems support terrorism in Europe. But when I say today, still in lectures, people go like, oh, that's all conspiracy theories. And then I say, no, it's not a conspiracy theory. We have Operation GLADIO. And then people go like, Operation GLADIO. But that was just for self-defense in case of a Soviet invasion. The Soviet invasion never came, so it's no problem. I said, no, it's not that simple. We have specific cases of terrorist attacks where right-wing extremists testify that they were protected by the secret services, and the members of the secret services testify that they were supported by members of the American establishment from the White House and the American Secret Service and from the Pentagon. So it's not hard proof. I can't call it hard proof. But as you said, it's circumstantial evidence that we have U.S. terrorism in Europe.
Well, I don't know, because, just again from your book, you say that you quote an Italian parliamentary commission that investigated GLADIO and the Italian massacres. The commission was concluded in the year 2000 that those massacres, those bombs, those military actions had been organized or promoted or supported by men inside Italian state institutions, and as has been discovered more recently, by men linked to the structures of United States intelligence. And this is from an Italian parliamentary commission. So, are they conspiracy theorists too?
No, of course not. They're not. This is hard data. This is historical fact. But keep in mind that you can't talk about these things with many people. Many people will go mad. They go like, this means, that the NSA has not only spied on the handy of Angela Merkel in Germany, because everybody goes like, we know that, and Obama said they wouldn't do it, and then they did it. But it's another thing if you set up totalitarian surveillance. It's not a good thing either, but it's, if you kill people with a terrorist attack, it is worse. It's clearly worse. It's people like, is it possible? And I've debated this with many colleagues, and these are highly trained academics, and I've told them, can you imagine that the Pentagon or the CIA or the MI6 from the UK would kill people in other countries of Europe with the strategy of tension. At most, just from their gut feeling, have said, no, I can't imagine that. And then I've shown them the quotes like the one that you said from the Italian Senate, and the Italian Senate has spent a lot of time investigating these secret operations, and they know the truth, okay? They've really found out the data, but they couldn't publish the names. So in that quote, you don't have a specific name of a specific person and a specific date of attack. It's a very general phrase which says U.S. terrorism in Italy is a fact. And the problem is that we can't go and say, oh, here it says Henry Kissinger in the National Security Council meeting of that date argued for strategy of tension in Italy. We don't have that specific data. And that's why I still say it is circumstantial evidence. I think it's solid evidence, but, standing, under rather strong pressure. I mean, I filed the Freedom of Information Act with the CIA. This is a law which allows you to get all the data from the CIA on all CIA operations during the CIA's history, during the last, it was created in 1947. And then I said, give me the data on Operation GLADIO. And then CIA wrote back, sorry, can't give you that data, it's top secret. And I said, well, we have a lot of data anyway here in Europe, because I read Italian, and a lot of this data is just in Italian. And some is in French, and some is in German. So the American scholars don't read these different languages. But I'm Swiss, and we speak quite a few languages, just because our country is made up of 3 languages. So then I read these Italian documents, and I write back to the CIA, and I say, please give me the data, because then you can participate in a discourse on Operation GLADIO, and this discourse will take place anyway. And then they write back and say, no, we can't give you any data. So the CIA is not transparent. They will never admit that they carried out terrorism in Italy. The second thing I did is I wrote to NATO. And then NATO said, oh, we can't give you any details on Operation GLADIO. And I said, why not? And I said, yeah, well, Switzerland is not a NATO country. And I said, well, I mean, we're surrounded by NATO countries, and I'd like to have 2 more details. And I said, okay, hand in a letter through the Partnership of Peace office, because Switzerland is a member of Partnership for Peace. And that's a stupid name for sort of kindergarten, for kindergarten of NATO, for countries who are not NATO members yet, but NATO would like to have them in NATO soon. And then, I wrote a letter, and I gave them all the details on the specifics that I was researching. And I said, it didn't exist. It never existed. And that's a lie, okay? NATO just says Operation GLADIO never existed. And so, that is incredible. You really have to keep in mind that the CIA and NATO don't like the GLADIO story at all.
Yeah, and to this day, that is their official line.
Their official line was in 1990, when the Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti said, we have the secret army in Italy, and it existed also in France and in Greece and in Belgium and everywhere. People were totally shocked in many countries. Then NATO said, we have never had secret armies. We don't do guerrilla warfare. We don't do secret warfare. And on the next day, a NATO spokesman had to come forward and say, what we said yesterday was wrong. Very sorry for it. We can't give you any further information because that's military secret.
Wow.
And, it's just,
they said
you ask yourself, what world are we living in?
Yeah, it's so Orwellian. We can neither confirm nor deny what we just said yesterday.
Yes. In the end, you have to take it with a punch of irony, because otherwise it'd be completely, you can't really support it. Yeah.
It's just when we talk about these terrorist attacks perpetrated by essentially NATO in Europe during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We're not talking about small scale, like 1 or 2 people killed. In some of them, these are major terror attacks. I mean, for example, Bologna was 80 people killed, I think, right?
Yeah, Bologna was 80 people. The problem is, I have to repeat that we can't link NATO directly to Bologna. We can link Bologna to right-wing terrorists. We can link the right-wing terrorists to the Italian Secret Service, and we can link the Italian Secret Service to NATO. That's what we can do. But the problem is that NATO then always comes forward and says, oh, gee, these were just runaway crazy guys on the lower level. Okay? We don't have written data where you have a NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe who says, please blow up a bomb in Bologna train set. We don't have that. Yeah. And that makes it very difficult for historians to nail it down. I mean, to really say, okay, come on, what have you done? I mean, it's the same thing with the Brabant massacres. I have to maybe quickly explain what the Brabant massacres are. We have to shift away from Italy and go to Belgium for a moment. In the 1980s, in Belgium, you had a series of shootings, of killings, of assassinations, which were carried out by highly trained gunmen. They drove to supermarkets and just shut everybody down there. You know, women, children, elderly. They just didn't care. And they didn't even take the money from the supermarket. So they were not robbers, but they were gunmen who wanted to terrorize Belgium. And they even went that far that sometimes they drove away and then the police followed them. So they waited for the police and shot the police too. I mean, these guys were really, you know, very nasty. And now in Belgium you have a debate, because Belgium is the headquarters of NATO in Europe. You have a debate whether these terrorist attacks on the Belgian supermarkets, which are so-called the Brabant massacres, that's how they're called, whether they were carried out by the stay-behind, whether they were carried out by NATO. And once again, you have to keep in mind that this is ongoing research. There's no definitive proof of one or the other version. But it is very, very difficult for the Belgians, as it was for the Italians, to find out that there was a secret army in Belgium. Now we have the confirmation. It existed. His code name was SDR8, so it's a different name than Gladio in Italy, but there was a secret army. It was linked to NATO. It was trained by CIA. It was trained by MI6. It was assisted by the Special Air Service of the British and the Green Berets by the Americans. So they were trained in covert action operations. But we still don't know whether the Brabant massacres were NATO terrorism. But they could be. It really could be. But think of it. I mean, think of a NATO operation killing people in supermarkets. How bizarre is that?
We do know that those same SAS and U.S. Special Forces were doing that exact kind of thing in places like Latin America.
That's it. We know that, yes. But there I always say, oh, yes, I mean, these are just Latinos. Kill them. Oh, yes, these are just Africans. Kill them. Oh, yes, Vietnamese. Kill them. You know, there is racism in research that if you kill somebody in Belgium, it's not the same that if you kill somebody in Sierra Leone. It's not the same. And this has to do with the discourse that we have in NATO countries. And the discourse basically is that we kill people outside of NATO. Okay? And you know, we bomb the Iraqis or... you know, I researched the language of the soldiers, and American soldiers in Iraq used phrases like, shoot the fucking sand nigger. Sorry for the language, but that's a direct quote.
Yeah.
And what does it mean? It means that the other human being has no right to live anyway. He's something like a cockroach. And that's the same thing that we had in Rwanda, you know. I'm very active in peace research, and we always have the same thing. First, you lose the right to be a human being and lose the right to be alive through the language. It happened also to the Jews during World War II, you know. They were considered animals, and then you just gassed them. Or it happened to the policemen in Germany during the Rote Armee Fraktion. The Rote Armee Fraktion was a German left-wing terrorist organization, and they said, policemen are pigs. And then pigs, you can slaughter pigs, right? And it's always in the language where human beings are sort of put on a level of ready to kill, death row, basically. And in this lingo, we know that we had strategy of tension in Chile. We know that we had it in Latin America, many places. We know that Cambodia was bombed illegally, and that Nixon manipulated the the entries of the Air Force to say that the bombs were dropped in Vietnam, whereas in fact some of them were dropped in Cambodia, but that would have been illegal, so they just changed the data. And we know all these things, but still, when we talk about Operation GLADIO, when we talk about NATO and with terrorism in Europe, it's like a massacre in your own family.
Yeah. So in dismissing the idea that white Westerners in power would kill white Western civilians,
women, children,
women and children, yeah, they evoke a kind of latent racism within Western populations. That that it's okay to kill them in other countries far off with brown-colored or whatever skinned people, and of course, if you mention the Second World War and the Jews, as you just did, the Holocaust, that was of course a crazed Nazi regime with Hitler, the madman. So that can be dismissed as well. But as you mentioned in your book, when it was brought up, when the GLADIO and strategy of tension and NATO's stay-behind armies was brought up in Germany, it was on a private television channel, RTL, announced that the German operation of GLADIO had included former members of Hitler's special forces.
Yeah, that's true, and that's true. The evidence is here. We have that evidence. Nazis in NATO secret armies.
Yeah, I mean, but
it's
also
a bizarre world, isn't it?
Jeez, but I mean, when we talk about this kind of racism, I mean, there's a lot of evidence from Northern Ireland that that the British military intelligence and civilian intelligence agencies during the so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland were involved in carrying out these kind of attacks on civilians in order to defame or to blame the IRA, for example. And just talking about the UK in your book as well, when it was brought up in the early 90s, just in 1990 or 1991, the then British Defence Secretary Tom King had to handle those kind of questions from reporters about GLADIO and NATO stay-behind armies, and he kind of joked about it and dismissed it, kind of thing. And there was also the fact that the Operation Desert Storm had just been announced, so that kind of pushed GLADIO off the papers. But it's interesting to me anyway, because I'm from Northern Ireland, that that Tom King, the Defence Secretary at the time, who dismissed these GLADIO questions from the reporters, he had just come from a post in Margaret Thatcher's government, which was just the year before in 1989. He was the Northern Ireland Secretary, so he came from being the Northern Ireland Secretary and overseeing at that time effectively a kind of GLADIO-style operation in Northern Ireland, where a strategy of tension was used to divide the communities and to discredit the groups like political parties like Sinn Féin and the IRA.
I think we can learn a lot if we look at these details. It's if we look at the conflict in Northern Ireland. You probably know more about it than I do. But one element which struck me was this military reaction force. It was called MRF. That was a secret force of British soldiers, but they were in plain clothes. And they had guns with silencers on them, and they patrolled through Belfast. And their job was to shoot IRA terrorists. So they, plainclothes, military people walking around in Belfast. And, sometimes they shot a real terrorist, and sometimes they got the wrong man and just shot him. And then you ask yourself, wait a moment, that's British tax money. And they give that to assassins. And these assassins then kill people. I mean, it's already hard to pay taxes, right? But when you know that your taxes is really going to assassins who are not, they are not accountable because they're in plain clothes. So if you walk around in Belfast, you'd think, this is just gangs. And then later, only years later, you find out, Jesus Christ, some of them were gangs in the sense of these were young men angry with no job, and they started to kill each other. I mean, they do that. I mean, if they're 18, they have no job, and if they're really angry because their friend's been shot, they you don't need a state to sponsor you. You can get angry yourself. I mean, it's possible. But not everybody was just gangs. Some of them were agents of the state. And if I look at that, then the military reaction force, MRF, I remember that name, operating in Northern Ireland, was a state terrorist organization. And I always, I'm struck at the level of superficial discourse that we have today, that we always go like, no, we wouldn't do that, and no, it has never happened, or a democratic state would never use terrorism to reach an aim. And I said, that's just nonsense. If you look at the French, what did they do? In 1985, they wanted to test nuclear bombs in the Pacific. And then this Greenpeace organization, which is an environmental organization, said, we don't want to have nuclear tests above ground in the Pacific. So they had a ship, which is called Rainbow Warrior, and they drove into that testing zone with their ship. And then, obviously the French couldn't do their nuclear test. Greenpeace had the ship exactly there where they wanted to explode the bomb. And then the French president, Mitterrand, he was a socialist, by the way, he said, well, that's not good. We have a ship in the way. Somebody has get rid of that ship. And then he said to his defense minister, Pierre Arnoux, get rid of that ship. And then he said, okay, I have to go to the boss of the Secret Service, Admiral Pierre Lacoste. And the boss of the Secret Service said, okay, I have to go, to my agents of the Direction Générale Sécurité Extérieure, DGSE, that's the French DA. And they just, had people who went to the ship, put a bomb on the ship, and then blew it up. I mean, that's terrorism. And that's state terrorism, French state terrorism. And it's just many in academia close their eyes and say, no, we have no state terrorism. And that's a problem, because if we're blind towards state terrorism, we'll not understand what happened during the last 70 years. We'll never understand it. It's part of the problem of this violence that we're all trapped in. I'm not saying everything is state terrorism. That's nonsense. But we need to understand that many on the higher levels of defense ministers, as Tom Haig or in the secret services, they are convinced that you can somehow do a violence management, a bit terrorism there, a bit of war lies here, and they will, provide some good results. And in fact, it doesn't.
I think part of the mental, emotional block people, ordinary people and academics who have access to far more information, the block they come against is, we're talking about a conspiracy here. I can think of a conspiracy, like a local one where, Party A wants to come into power and conspires against Party B. But this is so big, and we're talking about a large number of people, a large number of weapons, and a lot of money. And over 40 years, because the story really only broke in 1990. So I think when people try to do the arithmetic in their heads, that's probably where they go, no, this can't be true. Now,
that's it.
Yeah.
So they prefer to sort of block themselves from certain facts instead of having one heavy disappointment. Okay.
Yeah.
And I tell all my students, why don't you go through this one heavy disappointment, which basically tells you that some things are very nasty out there. It's not only in James Bond. It's really out there that you have secret warfare, you have manipulated terrorism, and we have the data to prove it. And it makes you sad. At the end of the day, it makes you sad, and you go like, what place do I live in, and why is this like that? But once you've gone through this certain sadness and depression, you wake up again, and you have a clearer vision. You're not sort of blocked by following the mainstream media every day, and they tell you now we have to bomb this country or that country. You go like, oh, why? Is that now true? Is it false? What's going on? Who's this terrorist organization I've never heard of, which is now the biggest threat worldwide? And then it gives you back your thinking, basically, your independence, and that's what German philosopher Immanuel Kant once said. He said, sapere aude, as in Latin. It basically means use your brain. I mean, be an independent human being. Be in dignity, and don't get fooled every day. I mean, there's no dignity in it.
And the truth shall set you free, as they say.
Yeah.
Daniele, thank you so much for being on with us today.
Thanks very much for an interesting conversation, and good luck to you.
Do you have any further plans for any updates on this story?
I mean, I follow secret warfare generally. You know, I look at it. I look at the 9/11 debate. I look at the Ukrainian debate. I look at Syria. I look at Libya, because I want to tell people also that it's only a very small minority of human beings who are engaged in this secret warfare. If you take 1% of the world population, that would make it 70 million people who carry out these attacks, who conspire and blow up the things and really kill and maim. It's only 70 million people. That's 1% of the world population. Now, the problem is that this 1% can do a lot of damage. That's true. 70 million armed people shooting around, raping. You know, you can see the mess. Yeah. But I'm saying if it's only 1%, and, you know, there's a lot of people out there who don't want it, who don't like it, and who try to get access to you know, research that actually, you know, shows how this whole thing works, then you can there's still reason to be positive. So that's maybe my conclusion. I don't want people to be negative once they've heard of secret warfare and strategy of tension and manipulated terrorism. Yes, it exists. Yes, we have the data for it. But I also want to mention that human beings, I think, are wonderful creatures. They can help each other. They can love each other. They can support each other. And it's not that they're all terrorists.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll let you go, Daniele, and thanks again for being on, and thanks for writing your book, because it's extremely valuable, and everybody who's listening to the show should really consider getting themselves a copy, because it lays out in very, very stark and plain detail exactly the kind of reality we live in, and this 1% and what they're capable of. So get the book.
Okay, thanks a lot for your help.
Okay, Daniele.
All the best. Take care. Bye.
I think we're going to leave it there for this week, folks. So thanks to Daniele Ganser. He's been a great guest and he's done some great work. We'll be back next week with another show.
Same time, same place. See you then.
All right, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.